We're broadcasting from the Smart Mobility Summit 2019. Several thousand industry professionals gathered here in Tel Aviv, and behind the scenes of the summit, as a part of the EcoMotion community, GoTo is interviewing selected mobility experts. My name is Katya Rosenauer, and today with me is Michael Granoff, Managing Partner at Maniv Mobility Fund. Hi, Michael.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Michael, before we begin, I want to play a little game with you. It's a game of choices, your personal life choices related to mobility. And not only that. I'll ask questions fast, and please answer fast as well without thinking, preferably. Bicycle or car?
Bicycle.
Train or plane?
Train. Depends on distance. It's hard to answer that without thinking.
Swimming or running?
Running.
Car sharing or taxi?
Car sharing.
iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
Amazon or AliExpress?
Amazon.
Elevator or stairs?
Stairs.
Stairs. So which floor are you climbing to normally?
Well, when I had an apartment on the 15th floor and then I became Shomer Shabbat, I learned how to climb stairs. But I generally tend to go for the stairs whenever it's practical.
Very healthy. Michael, you are very much into mobility, specifically as a fund, and I understand personally as well. So can you tell me what got you into mobility? How did you just woke up one day and decided this is the thing for me?
Well, I did wake up one day, but it was an evolution over many years, and that day was September 11, 2001, when I was a resident of Manhattan. And in the years that followed that, I gave a lot of thought to issues around national security and countering terrorism, and that led to a understanding of the role that the monopoly that oil has in global transportation played in geopolitics. And at that time, the U.S. was importing 70% of its oil, and in fact, oil still today represents about 93% of transportation. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that over the years that followed. Started an organization with a friend in Washington, D.C. in 2004 around energy security. And from there, we got a bill passed through Congress, signed by President Bush in 2006, that increased fuel economy standards and had the first in the world electric vehicle incentives. And I came away from that process with a very deep conviction that there actually was only one scalable way to break oil's monopoly in transportation, that was electrification.
Wait, so you were one of the people behind this thing with the electric vehicles?
Well, I was one of the people involved in lobbying for the 2006 energy bill in Congress,
Wow.
which actually wasn't hard to get through Congress. The hard thing was to get President Bush to sign it, because he came from oil roots. But the truth is, he was a very thoughtful person, and was actually led to understand that the implications of oil's monopoly were in everything from not just the environment to the macroeconomy and, in fact, national security. And understanding that, he signed that bill, and we set a precedent for governments encouraging electrification, which then obviously spread in an even broader basis to Europe and to China, and that we see today. And the interesting thing that of course then led me to try to find out how to go about electrification as a business, and the famous story the following year when I ended up speaking with two gentlemen, Elon Musk and Shai Agassi, and followed Agassi for 5 years and $1 billion into Better Place in Israel, which everyone in Israel knows how that turned out. But if you actually walk around this conference today, you will find at least a dozen people who are advancing mobility who came out of the Better Place experience.
Right. Just the timing wasn't.
No, the timing
right,
was exactly right. The execution was not good. The timing was right. You wouldn't actually do the same model today.
Interesting. Michael, so Maniv as a fund is very focused on mobility companies, right?
Exclusively focused on mobility, yes.
Yeah, so I understand now the rationale behind the choice, and like your whole story kind of, leads you to to do what you're doing right now. But what are the types of the companies that you are looking for? Because mobility is becoming bigger and bigger of a field. So
We have close to 30
after.
companies in our portfolio, and I would say close to no overlap among them. So you're right; it's a very broad field, and we see new opportunities all the time. But in our first portfolio, we invested mostly in Israeli companies. We invested in a lot of companies around data and communications, whether it was Autonomo monetizing data, Aurora Labs over-the-air updates, to automotive cybersecurity companies, upstream and C2A. We also invested in a lot of companies that were developing, enabling us technologies for autonomy, for greater safety and automation, and that includes Cognata, that does simulation software to develop autonomous systems. It includes Phantom Auto, which has teleoperations. And then in the current fund, the second fund, we have focused very broadly on mobility services enabled by new business models that are enabled by digital technologies and, in fact, electrification. So, for example, we have a company based in New York, in Brooklyn, that uses shared electric mopeds. Mopeds is a term that's used in the U.S.
So that we don't use scooters.
In Europe, they're confusingly called scooters. Here, two scooters but team, but in any event, everyone understands what we mean. And those have proven to be extremely popular. I like to say it's interesting that they are actually battery switchable electric vehicles, just like Better Place, except they have two wheels instead of four, and they are shared instead of owned. But that company has now deployed throughout Brooklyn and Queens, Washington, D.C., and I'm pleased to be able to say, as of today, that this week we'll be launching also in Austin, Texas.
So it seems that they've been growing really fast.
They have. We just finished a $27 million Series A.
Oh, okay. But is it like really taking off in the States? Because when I lived in the States, I don't remember that many people riding those mopeds, in the cities.
I don't remember any because they've hardly existed in the U.S. But that's what the founders noticed, that they worked very well in other places around the world. They hadn't been tried on a serious basis on a micro-mobility platform. And that's what Revel Transit has innovated. And, you ask, is it growing fast? Well, we started in late May with 1,000 mopeds in New York City, added 400 in Washington a few months ago, and we're about to drop more into Austin, Texas, but we're already approaching 1 million rides in that short period of time. So
that's quite a bit. And how many users? Do you see also the user base growing
absolutely, all the time.
People need licenses for mopeds in the States or not?
In most states in the U.S., including all the ones that we're operating in, you need nothing more than a driver's license. And if you have a valid driver's license in good standing without DWIs and things like that, you can get approved to be on the system within minutes.
Oh, that definitely helps.
Yep.
I want to talk a bit about your investment and your vision in the autonomous cars, because from the companies that you've mentioned, I understand that you envision the future of connected vehicles and autonomous driving, obviously. So how exactly do you think it's going to be deployed and commercialized?
Well, this is the question everybody asks. The question was asked on the last panel and throughout this conference, and it really obviously depends on how you define things, because we have pilot programs operating in many places around the world now, some doing better than others, but breaking through to commercialization to a real practical consumer product is really, it's proven to be much more difficult than people had thought a few years ago. And I think in 2016, the conventional wisdom was that we'd have mainstream commercial platforms for robotic taxis in major cities by 2021. And in fact, now I think there's very few people who'll defend that timeline. I personally think that it's going to be the latter part of the coming decade. But what I think is important to remember is that when autonomous vehicles do become practical on mainstream platforms in major cities, they're going to enter into cities that actually look very different than they do today. A lot will happen between now and then. We're going to see, I think, more change in city architecture and city mobility availability and policy in the next 5 years than we've seen in the last 50. That's my prediction. And in fact, the deputy mayor of Tel Aviv spoke on the last panel, just kind of validated that, saying that they want to make it much more difficult for cars because cars are the least efficient ways to move around increasingly dense cities.
Tell me, was that like everything that you've been observing in the autonomous sector, was that the trigger for you to start investing more into consumer-oriented services?
No, I don't think that there was a trigger. We're very opportunistic. We want to focus on mobility. We don't know anything about anything else. But within the world of mobility, we look at wherever in the world they are. We look at for the best entrepreneurs and the best ideas. And recently, we've seen a whole bunch in this area.
I mean, I keep hearing two opposite opinions. One opinion that there's a lot of money in micromobility, and another one is like all the business models are not really sustainable. I'm not sure how to make sense of that. What's your experience?
We had on that last panel right now the man who coined the term micromobility, Hortus Didu, and he just reminded us again that we are only 1 or 2 years into this new revolution in mobility. So it's very early to understand what will work, won't work. I do think that things do tend to get painted with broad brushes, and I think you have to look a little more granularly at unit economics. And the reality is that everyone understands that the first scooters that were dropped into cities, which literally were consumer scooters that these companies just repurposed, were not sturdy enough, were not designed to be sustainable and to give an investor-style payback. But the concept got out there, and that was the important thing. And now we see much more robust vehicles coming. There are going to be different platforms of micromobility, like I said, not just the kick scooters, but the mopeds and other things. We've seen, I'd say, a dozen or more business plans in the last 6 months that envision something that is bigger than a scooter and smaller than a car on a micromobility platform. So I think there's a lot of innovation still to come. I think the fundamental fact is that most car trips are less than 6 or 8 miles, and many of those can easily be substituted with a lighter type of vehicle.
Absolutely. What I heard from that panel is also that now we're talking about cities that are not really designed for micromobility, right? Do you see that as an obstacle for realizing the business models or not?
It's an obstacle right up until the point that the city realizes that they need to change, and I think we're beginning to see that already, and we'll see a lot more of it. What's really fascinating here is that what we're effectively witnessing is 200 experiments simultaneously being run around the world, where micromobility vehicles have gotten dropped into cities, and policymakers say, now what? We can't ignore this. The consumers want it. Nowhere is that more obvious than Tel Aviv. But it's depending on what the infrastructure is, it's either there's no place where it's natural today. But who says that it's natural that that cars get to take up parking on both sides and 2 lanes? And is that really 70-80% of the space between buildings that's devoted to cars? Is that really the way that it should be when the cars themselves are the least efficient way for individuals to move around a city? So I think if Mike Bloomberg were still mayor of New York City, I think we would already see an uptown avenue and a downtown avenue that were open only to vehicles under 500 pounds.
Yeah, good thing it's not like that. Tell me, Michael, you think we're already full of innovations and all the ideas, and now it's time to kind of think how to scale them, or is there still a room to innovate?
Well, there wasn't there a quote from the late 19th century where someone said everything that could be invented has been? There's obviously more room to innovate, and we're seeing it all the time. We're lucky enough to be able to see it on a daily basis in companies that come through our doors. Scaling obviously is also happening in parallel as it has to be. I think 10 years from now, I think cities are actually going to look very different than they do now. A lot more different than they have looked in the last 100 years, frankly.
So can you draw me a picture, like a proper picture of a city that looks different?
Well, I think there's going to be lots and lots of different models, but the bottom line is going to be that it's going to be a lot less of the traditional, certainly individually owned cars. A lot less of that, a lot less parking in central areas, and a lot more diversity of vehicle types and of service platforms.
Thank you, Michael. Any last words to the startups that might be interested in connecting with Maniv and like anything to
Sure.
share?
I mean, we're always open to hearing from entrepreneurs for sure. It's very easy to contact us through our website at maniv.com, and I would just send a word of encouragement to entrepreneurs that are out there that there is, as I said, lots of room to continue to innovate. As I think, you could have 10 years ago said, oh, isn't that interesting? The smartphone has been invented. That was one big innovation, and now it'll be a long time. No, that was the platform on which all innovation thereafter took place. And I think you can see this new mobility world in a similar way. There's lots of opportunities for creativity building on the platform that's now being created by these new forms of mobility.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.